everybody, it's been a while, but after a complete physics overhaul, some added content, and a handful of visual updates, I thought it would be a great time to revisit Bounty Drag Racing Evolved. If you're new to Bounty Drag Racing, I'm going to take you through what you need to know to get out onto the racetrack for yourself. If you're a returning player coming to grips with the new physics, I'll be making several passes in all different conditions and configurations, so you'll have a pretty good idea what to expect. And I'll be giving you all a decent working tune-up for one of the game's most popular classes. Of course, if you're a Bounty veteran and just missed the sound of my voice, you're welcome to hang around too. It's possible I'm doing something you haven't thought of yet, and maybe there's something here that's helpful. For those of you who have never heard of Bounty Drag Racing before, Bounty is an online open map drag racing game for PCs featuring a wide variety of cars and motorcycles and many of the most popular classes in the sport. The game is still in beta form, so it certainly still has its issues, but it has been a work in progress for some time with updates and new content released fairly regularly. If you want to give it a try and jump in on the action for yourself, you can find it on Steam. If you want to become a member of the community, the Bounty Discord server is a very interesting and active place where you can find all sorts of arguments about everything and information on coming events. There's a link to that on the main menu. If it's your first time there, tell them that Viper sent you. Maybe one day we can work out some sort of deal on all this DLC stuff. Like I said, it's been a while since I've done a Bounty Drag Racing video, and we're getting pretty darn close to hitting 1,000 subscribers here on this channel. It would be really great if it's a Bounty community that helps reach and surpass that goal, because on most days, I am one of you. If you've been playing Bounty for a while, probably already lined up together at least once at one time or another. And if you're planning to try Bounty for the first time, it's likely only a matter of time till I line up alongside you too. If you guys show me it's worth my time to keep doing these, then I'll be happy to do it. And the best way you can do that is to smash the living shit out of that thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already, share this with your friends, and let me know in the comments if and how this all works out for you. And don't be afraid to leave any questions you may have. I do my best to answer or help out anyone that asks. With all that out of the way, let's get right into it, and what better place to start than the beginning. You've sat patiently through the opening title screen and have now made it to the main menu. Since half this game is about driving, you're going to need to set up some controls. So that means going to the settings menu and choosing controls. Bounty recognizes a variety of controller types and some wheels. If you have none of those, it apparently does work with the keyboard and mouse as well. If you're using something other than the keyboard and mouse, the first thing you should do is go into the driving controls, choose all the keyboard binds, and remove them. This will allow you to use the in-game chat without causing your car to drive away at the same time. Whatever method you use is up to you. I have controls set up for throttle and brake, a trans brake to launch the car, although the cars will start automatically when you use the throttle, so having a specific button to do that also allows you to shut the car off as well rather than run out of fuel waiting in the staging lanes. I of course have a button assigned for shifting up and down through the gears, which is pretty standard. What might not be standard though is, since you can assign each button to more than one thing at a time, the buttons I use to start the engine and activate the parachutes also put the car into neutral. This saves having to constantly check what gear the car was last in each time you start it. Moving down, there's a control for purging nitrous, the bump box, parachute, burnout mode, and if you're so inclined there's now a bang button. And you can also toggle the car's hood on or off if you wish. Once you have the driving controls, you'll probably want at minimum one button for changing camera views on your controller, and possibly more, which I mostly have assigned to various keys on my keyboard, not used while simply typing messages in chat. Now with all that set up, you need to hit the garage and pick a car. Well, there's a pretty good variety of cars and classes to choose from. The reality is, in a small but growing racing community, people tend to stick with only a small handful, so many of these cars and bikes are sadly if ever used. With that said, it only makes sense to point you to the most popular cars in the community, and that's the Pro Modifieds. Without the added DLC, you have a choice between two cars, this newly updated Corvette or this first-gen Camaro. Since I like the Camaro better and I'm the one making the video, we'll be choosing this. You of course are free to choose whatever car you like, just keep in mind that each car in each class has sometimes slightly and sometimes severe setup differences and needs for the particular chassis. So what we're doing here today might not directly correlate to the other cars or combinations. With the car selected, we can return to the main menu and find somewhere to race by clicking race. From here you have two choices. If you click lobby, you're free to jump into any room that interests you. While in most lobbies it won't matter what class or car you're using, if you see a specific class in the lobby's name, Pro Mod Shootout or Pro Stock Test and Tune for example, showing up in those lobbies in anything other than those classes can result in you getting kicked from those lobbies. If you choose to host, you're the boss. You can name the lobby whatever you wish and set all the race conditions as you like. We'll get to that shortly. If you want some alone time to just test some shit out, there's a privacy option that makes your lobby invisible to all but those on your Steam friends list. For this, we'll be testing privately. Where you would like to test and race is up to you. Bounty Drag Racing comes with 5 full-length quarter-mile capable prep drag strips, the newly revamped Straight Line Media Raceway, the newly renamed South Beach Motorsports Park, my current favorite, the Caribbean International Speedway, the newest Australia Dragway, and the brand new to Bounty Sunset Performance Engines Motorplex, which looks an awful lot like a certain track in Texas. We also have Arecibo Motorsports Park, a tricky 8th mile only prep track. For the street outlaw types, there's 2 8th mile unprepped street courses, one set in the desert and one in the backwoods. For the dirt slingers out there, there's the 330-foot Roifa sand drags. For a pro mod here today, we're going to stick to the pavement and head to South Beach Motorsports Park. Our first order of business when we're loaded into the track is to get our car set up. So we'll click on Tune Vehicle and start by picking our class and engine. For Pro Modifieds, you have 4 choices of boost combinations. By default, the cars are fitted with the centrifugal supercharger, most commonly known as a Pro Charger. The most common among the Bounty community is a big block blower combo. If you want something quieter, you can go with the twin turbos. And if you like your horsepower from a bottle, you can go with the big block nitrous motor. Although of the 4, the nitrous combination, at least in my hands, seems a little down on power from the rest. We're going to be starting out once again in what's most common in the community and begin with the blower combination. So we'll choose that and click apply before working on the tune-up. Now, as I'm making this video, there really is no good default starting setup in the game for new racers to begin with. So I'm going to run you through my setup, starting with the engine tuning. I use the idle RPM to adjust the rolling speed of the car while it's in gear, just idling. As long as you have the car's clutch engagement RPM below the idle RPM, the car will roll on its own in gear, and that makes it far easier to stage than having to use the throttle to move the car forward. It's pretty common to see new players jumping back and forth over the starting line, trying to get the car to the right spot. While many of the engine combinations have different damage thresholds before they blow, I found that there doesn't actually seem to be any specific engine or RPM related power curves, and despite a yellow warning symbol, all 4 of the engines we'll be using here are able to survive at least 1 full quarter-mile pass without bursting into flames before the finish line, if we set the limit at 9,500. For most cars, I usually have them set up to shift 500 RPMs before the rev limiter kicks in. This gives me time to hit the gear changes before that activates for the cars I shift manually. This setup will work any way you want the gears shifted, but for those who do shift manually, it's set at 9,000. The launch control RPM controls how high the engine will rev while you're holding the trans brake on the starting line waiting to launch. I haven't really noticed any particular sweet spot for this yet, as it seems to work fine in a wide RPM range as long as your converter settings are adjusted accordingly. The ignition cut duration, I've never really touched. Maybe that's why I suck. I don't think it would affect performance necessarily, but who knows. If you know something I don't, let me know. The bump box duration is something that I have set up for every car I use in this game. The cars tend to bounce backwards an inch or 3 after you put your thumb on the trans brake button. This sometimes leaves you an inch or 2 short of actually being staged. Having a bump button at the ready allows you to bring up the RPMs and bump forward that last little bit without having to let go of the trans brake and wait for the car's timing sequence to run through. The lower the numbers here, the shorter the bump. Too high, and the car can easily bump right past the starting line. Too low, and it might not even move. I use 0.05 to 0.06 in my cars, and as for bump aggressiveness, I think 0.5 is default, and that works just fine for me, so I haven't really messed with it. The ignition timing. This is where I usually go when everything else has been messed with, or if I need just a small change in how the power is applied. In short, the higher the number for a given part of the run, the more power the engine is making. The tuning window is plenty big enough in Bounty that you can easily just get away with setting all of this for max power, if it's accounted for elsewhere in the setup, through gearing or converter settings. For this particular setup, I find ramping the power in a little bit more gradually than that works pretty well, at least in certain conditions. While we're not going to get too deep into the effect that the weather conditions have on how the car performs, I will say that most of the tuning changes I make to accommodate those happen in the transmission gearing and converter settings. While the Pro mods are limited to 5 gears maximum, these gear ratios are set up to only use 4 on a quarter-mile pass, with 5th being an option if I were to run a high enough final drive. The higher the numbers here, the quicker the car will accelerate through that particular gear. Having the ratio spaced out properly is really important in keeping the engine RPMs in the power band. If the RPMs drop too far, the car knows it's over and loses time. If the gears are too close together, you quickly run out of available gears. For For shifting those gears, you have 3 options. You can shift them manually or have them shifted automatically, either according to preset times or by engine RPM. Assuming you're hitting your shift points in manual mode, there's no real performance differences between any of these methods, and these numbers will work with whichever way you like to drive. Onto the drivetrain. Now, unless you have a working wheel and pedal setup and feel like going full old school hardcore mode, you're going to want to choose a torque converter over the clutch. Engagement RPM is just what it sounds like. This sets the RPM at which the clutch engages enough to begin moving the car. Like I said while we were looking at the engine tuning, as long as your engine's idle RPM is higher than this engagement RPM, then you won't need to use any throttle to move the car forward or backwards. As for the rest of this stuff, like I said before, this in the gearing is where you make many of the changes between conditions, and it's not entirely intuitive, so I'd be lying if I said I understood even half of it. Rather than possibly misleading you, for now, you'll have to trust that these settings will get you down the track and give you somewhere to start. If I ever figure it out further, well, perhaps that could be another video. Moving on to the suspension and starting in the front. For the most part, almost all the cars I'll use in Bounty have very similar suspension settings to what we'll be using here. Usually the biggest difference between the various cars is the ride heights. Too high of a setup will result in a car that wants to wheelie, and too low will result in a car that won't. Since drag racing is all about getting enough traction to drive high horsepower cars down a racetrack, how much grip a car has depends on how well it's able to transfer its weight onto the rear tires, and this comes down to the suspension settings. As far as the front suspension goes, for the most part, put simply, the lower the max force and bump, and the higher the ride height and rebound is, the better the weight transfer. Since you want the rear of the car to be able to plant the car's weight onto the racetrack instead of transferring it back to the front, with the exception of the ride height, which still makes more grip the higher it is for some reason, the rear of the car plants best with higher max force and bump rates to allow more of the car's weight to force the rear tires onto the pavement rather than absorbing that energy through the springs. And a lower rebound to not send the energy back so quickly that it possibly unloads the rear tires enough to lose traction is better. Since we're building a Pro Mod and not a radial tire car, we can move on to the chassis adjustments. Here things are pretty straightforward. The weight transfer settings work like ballast. The further to the left it is, or the lower the number, the more the weight is concentrated on the rear of the car. While the obvious use for this would be to have all of the weight on the rear of the car, not all of the cars and setups benefit from that, and there's such a thing as too much grip sometimes depending on the tune-up and conditions. And this can be a simple way to control how aggressively a car is able to launch. The wheelie bar heights will vary by car, and ride heights. The minimum settings affect how low the bars sit while not under load, and the max is how much they're able to move before stopping, essentially controlling how much and how aggressively a car will wheelie. If these are set up too low, obviously the car won't wheelie at all, or it may essentially bottom out, meaning the wheelie bars are on the ground and preventing the car from fully planting the rear suspension and tires. What works best really depends on the car. The last part of the tuning equation is the boost settings. For our big block blower combination, that means a supercharger pulley. Without any sort of consequences for, let's call it engine mismanagement, beyond the wear and encourage should your rev limiter be set too high, with so many ways to absorb and manage any horsepower levels we're able to throw at these things, for the most part, for heads-up competition, there's no reason to not use all the power you can get. So that means full boost for the big block blower and ProCharger engines. Full boost in all but first gear in the turbo setup, in the maximum available nitrous loads that ramp in very quickly, resulting in the nitrous car usually being the quickest to 60 foot. The rest of the tuning settings are of the cosmetic variety. New with the recent physics update is an assortment of customization options ranging from various supercharger intakes for the blower cars to exhaust configurations on other engine combos, a handful of rims with a handful of colors to choose from, 3 choices of tire lettering, wing types, parachutes, and more. Now, you've heard me mention different weather and track conditions a few times. What do I mean by that? If you're new to drag racing, or haven't played this game since the new physics update, Bounty Drag Racing has a continuous day-night cycle where the time of day dictates the air and track temperatures, and it attempts to simulate the effects that has on the cars and the performances. All of the prep tracks in the game pretty much have identical traction levels as each other, so a car set up to work here at South Beach will run more or less the same at other tracks in the same conditions. Internal combustion engines need oxygen to burn as much fuel as they're able. How much oxygen is available depends largely on your altitude, air temperature, and humidity. Closer to sea level you are, the more oxygen is available and the more power an engine can make. The less water vapor you have in the air, the more oxygen is available, the more power your engine can make. Finally, the cooler the air temperature is, the more dense it is, the more oxygen there is in every cubic liter of air an engine sucks in, the more power an engine can make. The track temperature should dictate grip levels, but I haven't really seen much difference in that regard from one extreme to the other. The biggest difference you're going to notice really comes down to how much power the car is able to make, and since, at least for now, the weather cycle from track to track is identical, with overall density altitude correlating with exactly the same track temperatures every time, the only number I pay attention to is the density altitude. Well, the setups definitely benefit from different things from different conditions. I'll be using the same tune to make runs at a few different times a day so you can see the performance differences. For those of you very new to this, I'm going to run you through the driving process as well. Before we hit the track, we're going to hit the escape key and change a couple options. Since we're here by ourselves, we'll set the Christmas tree to solo so we don't have to wait 7 or 8 seconds before the lights go yellow. We're going to run the default 400 Pro tree heads up, and since I'm plenty capable of squeezing down on the throttle trigger a couple seconds longer than, sadly, much of the bounty community, we're going to take it all the way to the scoreboards like it was for decades and set it to the quarter mile. Hitting escape also brings up an option to tow directly to one of the burnout boxes. Doing this in a lobby with more than a couple people in it can be really annoying and kind of a dick thing to do in my opinion. From this screen here, I'll have the car towed to the lanes, click drive, and we're in control and ready to go. Bring this thing to life and roll on into the burnout box. Well, the option is there to activate the Go Gadget burnout mode that enables the car to spin the tires more easily. I find that if a car is set up right, you don't really need it. Not using it means not forgetting to turn it off again before you make your pass. Burnouts do, however, now affect the tire's grip, so we need to hold the brake, go full throttle, give it a respectable amount of time, and roll off the brake. If you're new to drag racing, staging the car involves watching the top bulbs on your side of the Christmas tree. Rolling in gently, the first light you turn on tells you you're pre-staged and inches away from being fully staged. To avoid the car rolling backwards, and since there are no other cars to hold us up, as soon as I'm pre-staged, sometimes I'll hold the trans brake button, go full throttle, tap the pump button, and we're staged. Off at the first flash of yellow, the car does its thing through the gears, and we run a 388 to the 8th mile and a 5.96 at 243 miles per hour to the quarter in hot mid-afternoon conditions. Being done with the pass, we can hit escape and have the car towed to the pits, where our first order of business should always be maintenance. Forgetting to do this might result in your engine bursting into flames. With that done, we'll progress the time to early morning, where instead of a density altitude of over 1,500 feet, it's now a little over 900, and the track temperature has come down. Let's take it back up and see what it runs now. Same setup on a different time of day, we've went from a 5.96 at 243 miles per hour to a 5.71 at over 246. Okay, let's take it down to some near prime time conditions and give this one more pass before we compare it to the other engine combinations. And a 5.68 248 to the quarter mile for the big block bone Camaro. That's about a tenth off of what you would need to be a serious threat to win within the community, but it's a pretty good baseline and, in my opinion, a pretty good start. Back to the pits, I'm going to change absolutely nothing but the engine. We'll see how this works with the centrifugal supercharger. 3.66 206 to the 8th and a 5.71 242 to the quarter. Not quite as quick as a screw blower, but not all that far off given it's the exact same setup. Okay, back to the pits, we'll put the boys back to work and they'll swap out a Pro Charger for a couple of turbos. We'll button it back up and go again. You've probably noticed the two gauges here beside the digital display. Well, the one on the left is used only for nitrous cars. The one on the right here displays boost levels at any given time. While the blower and Pro Chargers build their boost pretty much the moment you give it throttle, the turbos take a moment to spool up, so it's important to keep this in mind. When staging up, you want to get on the trans brake when both you and your opponent, if you have one, are pre-staged. Then you hit the throttle until you've built up enough boost to ensure it will be full by the time you launch before you bump into fully staged. Twin turbo combo runs a 3.65 208 to the 8th and a 5.68 249 to the quarter, just a tick behind the blower car to the 8th and identical enough to the quarter. Okay, to avoid paying the boys here time and a half overtime, we'll get them to swap the turbo motor for a nitrous setup and make one last pass. Here's where we're going to be paying attention to that gauge on the left. And when we finally get to make use of that purge button, full bottle pressure for the nitrous cars here is 1500, and purging the nitrous will not only lower that pressure and make you look really cool at the same time, it will also affect how the car performs. I haven't done enough testing to tell you what pressure works best at any given time, but I have done enough to know that it does make a difference. In this setup here, we'll purge it down to 1250 and see what it does. Be aware, however, that at least as it is now, bottle pressure takes some time to build back up, even after a pass and a refill in the maintenance menu. So if you're one of those that like to try and purge the bottles near empty, you're going to need to factor that in. Again, with no setup changes other than the motor, the nitrous combo puts up a 3.71 200 to the 8th and a 5.83 234 to the quarter mile. That's 7 or 8 miles per hour down from the rest by half track, and 14 or 50 miles per hour down by the quarter mile. I like them, they look cool, and the flames look badass, but if you're running a heads-up pro mod event, especially the ultra rare quarter miler, you're going to want to choose something else for now. Anyway, that wraps things up. I hope I've given you new players enough to hit the ground running, and maybe some of you veterans some ideas that you hadn't thought of. I hope you all enjoyed this. Thank you for watching. Until next time, keep it in your own damn lane. Peace.